Stallone saw a veteran kicked out, so he sat down and made room. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. It was a day that began with the deceptive quiet of routine, one of those sun-drenched Los Angeles afternoons where the world feels simple and slow. For Sylvester Stallone, it was a rare pocket of normalcy carved out of a life lived in the public eye. He had chosen a small, unassuming diner called the Golden Spoon, a place tucked away on a side street, known less for celebrity sightings and more for its honest coffee and perfectly crisp bacon. It had a classic Americana charm: red vinyl booths, a long Formica countertop, and a gentle clatter of cutlery against ceramic. Stallone, dressed down in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, had slid into a booth near the back, hoping for a quiet lunch and a moment to read a script. He was just a man enjoying a meal, anonymous for a precious few minutes. The diner's owner, a portly man named Frank Rizzo, prided himself on the establishment's reputation. Frank was a whirlwind of manufactured bonhomie, his smile as bright and hard as the polished chrome on the coffee urns. He moved through his domain with a proprietary air, greeting customers he deemed worthy with a loud laugh and a slap on the back, while his eyes constantly scanned for anything that might tarnish the curated image of his little kingdom. It was in the middle of this placid scene that the third key figure of the day's impending drama made his quiet entrance. He was an older man, his face a testament to a hard-lived life, his clothes worn and frayed. A faded olive-drab jacket, reminiscent of a military field coat, hung loosely on his thin frame. He moved with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue, yet he held himself with a straight-backed dignity that seemed at odds with his destitute appearance. He didn't ask for a handout or cause a fuss. He simply found an empty booth in the corner, far from the other patrons, and sat down, as if trying to shrink into the vinyl, to become invisible. He was the picture of a man seeking nothing more than a moment's refuge from the harshness of the world outside. The initial interactions in the diner continued their peaceful rhythm. Frank glad-handed a table of tourists. A waitress refilled Stallone's iced tea with a polite nod, and the quiet man in the corner sat silently, a ghost at the feast. But the calm was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold reservoir of prejudice, and it was about to crack. The shift began when Frank Rizzo's roving gaze finally landed on the corner booth. His practiced smile evaporated instantly, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl of profound irritation. To Frank, the man wasn't a potential customer. He was a contamination, a blight on the carefully polished image of the Golden Spoon. He wiped his hands on his apron, a gesture of scrubbing away something unclean, and began his purposeful stride toward the corner. Stallone, glancing up from his script, noticed the change in the owner's demeanor. He'd seen that look before, the predatory focus of a bully who has found his target. He lowered his script slightly, his attention now fixed on the unfolding scene. The incident was beginning. Frank arrived at the booth and loomed over the older man, his shadow falling across the table. He didn't greet him. He spoke in a low, conspiratorial tone, loud enough only for the man and a keen observer like Stallone to hear. "Can I help you?" he asked, the question a clear dismissal. The older man looked up, his eyes weary but clear. "Just resting a moment," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I'll be on my way." Frank leaned in closer, his voice laced with a condescending sweetness that was more insulting than a shout. "Look, pal, this is a place of business. You're not ordering, and frankly, you're making my other customers uncomfortable." He gestured vaguely around the room, though no one was paying the slightest attention to the corner booth. It was a lie, a convenient fiction to justify his cruelty. The older man's quiet dignity remained intact. "I'm not bothering anyone, sir." But Frank was already past the point of reason. His personal offense at the man's poverty had curdled into righteous indignation. "That's not for you to decide," he hissed. "You need to leave. Now." Stallone's jaw tightened. He put his script down on the table, his lunch forgotten. The subtle shift in his posture was imperceptible to most, but it was a sign of gathering storm clouds. The air in the diner, once filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and fried food, now seemed to crackle with a nascent, ugly tension. The quiet drama in the corner was no longer private. The escalation was as swift as it was brutal. The veteran, whose name the world would later learn was Arthur Jensen, tried to appeal to the owner's better nature, a nature that was tragically absent. "Sir, please, just a glass of water. It's hot outside." It was a simple, humble request, the plea of a man seeking the most basic human courtesy. For Frank Rizzo, this was not a plea but an act of defiance. It was the moment his simmering resentment boiled over into open aggression. He slammed his hand flat on the table, the sharp crack causing several nearby patrons to jump. "I don't run a charity here," he snarled, his voice now loud enough to draw glances from across the room. "My customers pay for their seats. You're taking up space. You want water? Go find a public fountain. Now get out before I call the cops." He pointed a thick, trembling finger toward the door, his face flushed with a sense of his own power. Arthur Jensen visibly flinched at the outburst. The quiet dignity in his posture sagged, replaced by a look of profound humiliation. He slowly, painstakingly, began to slide out of the booth, his movements stiff with age and weariness. He was a man who had clearly seen the worst of humanity and was now facing it again over a simple glass of water. The atmosphere in the diner had now become palpably toxic. Diners stopped their conversations, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. A young couple in the next booth stared, eyes wide with shock. The waitress stood paralyzed by the counter, a pot of coffee growing cold in her hand. This was no longer just an uncomfortable moment. It was a public shaming, a raw and ugly display of power over the powerless. Stallone watched it all, his expression now one of cold, controlled fury. He saw not just a rude owner and a homeless man. He saw a deep and unforgivable violation of a fundamental code, a code of respect, of honor, of decency. He saw a man whose worn-out jacket spoke of a past of service being treated like garbage. And in that moment, the actor, the celebrity, the public figure receded, and what was left was the man, the son of an immigrant, the creator of underdog heroes, who knew, in his very bones, that this was a fight he had to join. The aggression reached its peak when Arthur, moving too slowly for the enraged owner, fumbled as he stood. His worn boot caught on the base of the table, and he stumbled, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the back of the booth. For Frank Rizzo, this was the final offense, an act of clumsiness that seemed to confirm the man's worthlessness in his eyes. "For God's sake, can't you even walk straight?" Frank spat, the words dripping with contempt. He then did the unforgivable. He reached out and grabbed Arthur's thin arm, his fingers digging into the worn fabric of the old jacket. "Let me help you out," he said, his voice a mocking snarl, and he began to physically manhandle the older man towards the diner's entrance. A collective gasp rippled through the room. This was no longer about rules or business. It was a physical assault on an elderly man. Arthur's face was a mask of shock and pain. He didn't fight back, but his body went rigid, a silent testament to the deep violation he was enduring. It was at this precise moment that Sylvester Stallone stood up. He didn't push his table away or knock over his chair. He rose to his full height with a quiet, deliberate grace that was more commanding than any sudden movement. The entire diner, which had been a sea of murmuring and shocked glances, fell into an absolute, pin-drop silence. Every eye in the room swiveled to him. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic thumping of Frank Rizzo's own heart as he slowly turned to see the source of the sudden stillness. Stallone's voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was a low, steady rumble that cut through the tension-filled air like a hot knife through butter. "Hey!" It was a single word, delivered with the weight of an anvil. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Frank froze, his hand still clamped on Arthur's arm. His jaw went slack as he recognized the face staring at him from across the room. "Let go of him." Stallone's voice was still quiet, but it now carried a steely edge of command, a tone that left no room for argument. It was the voice of a man who had drawn a line, and Frank Rizzo, bully and coward, had just staggered across it. The principled stand had been taken, and the power in the room was about to shift with the force of an earthquake. The breaking point was not a fiery explosion, but a moment of chilling, deliberate action. Frank Rizzo, caught between the adrenaline of his own petty tyranny and the shock of being confronted by a global icon, was momentarily paralyzed. He let go of Arthur's arm as if it were red-hot, a reflexive response to the sheer force of will directed at him. He tried to compose himself, to salvage some shred of his authority. "Mr. Stallone," he began, his voice a pathetic squeak, a stark contrast to his earlier bellowing. "This is a misunderstanding. This man, he was causing a disturbance. He was trying to frame the narrative, to paint himself as the victim, the hardworking business owner protecting his livelihood. It was this desperate, self-serving lie that pushed Stallone past the point of mere intervention. He saw in Frank not just a bully, but a man completely devoid of empathy, a moral vacuum. Stallone didn't walk toward Frank. He didn't raise his voice. He did something far more powerful, far more symbolic. With the entire diner watching his every move, he walked calmly past the humiliated Frank and the trembling Arthur. He walked directly to the corner booth, the one that had been declared a contaminated zone, the seat of the unwanted. He slid into the red vinyl seat, the very place Arthur had been ejected from just moments before. He placed both of his large hands flat on the table, claiming the space as his own. This single, quiet act was the climax of the confrontation. It was a physical and moral alignment with the victim. It was a declaration that the ground where the humiliated had stood was now sanctified ground. He looked across the booth at the empty seat. Then his eyes moved slowly and deliberately until they met Frank Rizzo's. He didn't need to say a word. The action itself was a thunderous rebuke. He had not just entered the fight. He had taken over the battlefield, not with fists, but with a simple, profound gesture of solidarity that stripped Frank of all his power. The owner stood there, stranded in the middle of his own diner, rendered utterly impotent. The hunter had become the hunted, and the entire room was the jury. With the power dynamic in the diner irrevocably shattered, Stallone seized the moral high ground with surgical precision. He sat in the unwanted booth, a king on a vinyl throne, and leveled a gaze at Frank Rizzo that was not hot with anger, but cold with a deep, cutting disappointment. A disturbance? Stallone's voice was calm, almost conversational, which made his words all the more devastating. "I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. The only disturbance in this diner is you." He let that sink in, allowing the truth of the statement to echo in the silent room. Frank's face went from flushed red to a pale, sickly white. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Stallone continued, his gaze flicking for a moment to the faded, worn jacket Arthur was wearing. "You see a problem? You see a vagrant. You see someone who's bad for business." He then looked back at Frank, his eyes boring into him. "You know what I see?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. "I see a man who might have been wearing a uniform not so different from that jacket, so you could have the freedom to run this business. A man who might have stood on a wall somewhere, so you could stand here and feel big by kicking him out." The condemnation was absolute. He had reframed the entire event, contrasting Frank's petty, commercial concerns with the grand, noble concepts of service, sacrifice, and freedom. He then turned to the other diners, his voice projecting slightly, including them in his judgment. "What kind of place is this?" he asked them, not aggressively, but with genuine, sorrowful curiosity. "What kind of town, where we treat our elders, our veterans like this?" He had made Frank's personal ugliness a community problem, forcing everyone to examine their own conscience. Then came a masterstroke. He completely ignored the owner, dismissing him as irrelevant. He caught the eye of the waitress, who was still standing, frozen, by the coffee station. He gave her a small, kind smile. "Excuse me, miss," he said politely. "Could you please bring my friend here a glass of water?" He gestured to Arthur, who was still standing numbly near the entrance. "And I'd like to order 2 plates of your best breakfast. One for me and one for him." He then looked directly at Arthur, his expression softening into one of pure, unadulterated welcome. "Arthur," he said, somehow knowing or guessing a name that fit the man's dignified bearing. "Please, come sit with me. You're my guest." In this narrative, the definitive action was not a walk-off, but a sit-in. It was a profound reversal of the typical confrontation, a more powerful and permanent statement. By refusing to leave, Stallone was planting a flag. He was declaring that this small corner of a common diner was now a sanctuary of decency, and he would not surrender it back to the forces of prejudice. His action of inviting Arthur to join him was the ultimate dismissal of Frank Rizzo. He had rendered the owner a ghost in his own establishment. The true owner of the moment was now Stallone, his currency not money, but moral authority. He turned his body slightly in the booth, his back partially to Frank, a clear, nonverbal signal that their conversation was over. He focused all of his attention on Arthur, who stood by the door, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. The veteran looked from Stallone to the humiliated owner to the watching faces of the other patrons. He seemed caught between a lifetime of being told to move along and this one unbelievable invitation to stay. "Sir, Arthur began, his voice cracking with an emotion he had long since learned to suppress. Stallone simply patted the vinyl seat opposite him. "There's a hot meal waiting for you, friend," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let's not let it get cold." This was his final statement, not a speech to the crowd or a last bar to his antagonist, but a simple human act of kindness. It was a withdrawal from the conflict and an entry into communion. The battle for the diner's soul was over, and Stallone had won it not by driving the enemy out, but by inviting the exiled in. Arthur, taking a deep, shuddering breath, slowly began to walk towards the booth. Each step was a vindication, a reclamation of the dignity that Frank had tried to strip from him. As he slid into the seat opposite the movie star, he was no longer a homeless man. He was an honored guest. The immediate aftermath in the Golden Spoon was a study in contrasts. On one side of the room, there was a quiet, powerful sense of restoration. Arthur sat opposite Stallone, tears silently tracing paths down his weathered cheeks as a waitress, her own eyes glistening, gently placed a tall glass of ice water in front of him. She gave Stallone a look of profound, unspoken gratitude before turning and walking away, refusing to even glance at her boss. The two men, the icon and the forgotten, sat in a comfortable silence, a bond forged in a crucible of public humiliation and unexpected grace. On the other side of the room, Frank Rizzo's world had crumbled. He stood in the middle of the floor, a statue of impotent rage and public shame. His authority was gone, his pride was in tatters, and his diner had been morally commandeered from him. He watched as several of his regular customers, people he'd shared jokes with for years, silently stood up from their tables, left cash to cover their bills, and walked out without a word or a backward glance. Their departure was a verdict. Then, something remarkable happened. A man from a nearby table, a businessman in a crisp suit, walked over to Stallone's booth. He didn't say anything to the actor. He looked at Arthur, reached into his wallet, and placed a $100 bill on the table. He simply nodded at the veteran, a gesture of deep respect, and walked out. This act broke the spell of silence. A quiet ripple of applause started in the back and spread through the remaining patrons. It wasn't a loud, raucous ovation, but a soft, sustained clapping, a collective acknowledgement of the decency they had just witnessed. Frank Rizzo looked at the applauding customers, at the money on the table, at the back of Stallone's head, and he seemed to shrink. The blustering, arrogant owner had been reduced to a pathetic, irrelevant figure in his own story. He turned and shuffled back towards the kitchen, his shoulders slumped in defeat, disappearing behind the swinging doors, a man in full retreat from the consequences of his own character. The diner was no longer his. It belonged to the quiet dignity in the corner booth. The story of what happened to the Golden Spoon did not stay within its walls. In the age of the smartphone, decency, and the lack thereof, is always being recorded. A young woman at the counter had, with a shaking hand, filmed the entire confrontation, from Frank's initial aggression to Stallone's quiet, commanding intervention and the final, beautiful moment of Arthur sitting down to a meal. She posted the video online with a simple caption. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they just order you breakfast. Before the two men had even finished their meal, the video had begun its inexorable march toward virality. It spread from local social media groups to national news aggregators with breathtaking speed. The hashtags #StalloneStans and #GoldenSpoonOfShame began trending. News vans, tipped off by the explosion online, were soon parked outside the small diner, their cameras pointed at the front door like a firing squad. Frank Rizzo's life became a public inferno. The diner's Yelp and Google pages were flooded with one-star reviews, not just from locals, but from people across the globe who had seen the video. They recounted the story of his cruelty, calling him a disgrace. His business, once his pride and joy, became a symbol of public contempt overnight. The public reaction was a tidal wave of support for Stallone and Arthur. Veterans groups across the country share the video, praising Stallone's actions as a perfect example of the phrase, "I've got your six." Donations poured into national homeless veteran charities. The video was played on every major news network, with commentators dissecting the moment as a powerful, real-life parable about the state of compassion in modern society. The story wasn't just about a celebrity doing a good deed. It was a raw, unfiltered look at how society treats its most vulnerable and the profound impact one person can have when they refuse to be a bystander. The small, quiet diner had become the stage for a national morality play, and the world was the audience. The long-term repercussions of that single lunch resonated for years, etching themselves into the lives of everyone involved. For Sylvester Stallone, the incident further burnished his public image, but in a way that transcended celebrity. He was no longer just a man who played Rocky and Rambo. He was seen as a man who embodied their spirit of championing the underdog. He never exploited the moment, never gave an interview about it, allowing his actions to speak for themselves. This restraint only amplified the public's respect for him. He had demonstrated that true strength wasn't about physical power, but about the power of one's character. For Arthur Jensen, the day was a resurrection. The publicity from the event brought his story to light. It turned out he was a decorated Vietnam veteran who had fallen on hard times after a series of personal tragedies. National veterans aid organizations, spurred by the public outcry, stepped in. Within weeks, Arthur was in a safe transitional housing program, receiving medical care, counseling, and job assistance. The man who had been invisible was suddenly seen. He became a face for the silent struggles of countless veterans, and his story inspired a renewed push for federal and state-level support. He was given not a handout, but a hand up, all because one person had refused to look away. Frank Rizzo's fate was a cautionary tale. The Golden Spoon, once his little kingdom, bled customers until it was no longer viable. He was forced to sell it at a significant loss, the name forever tainted. He became a local pariah, a living symbol of petty cruelty. The incident forced him into a period of harsh reflection, a man undone by his own lack of compassion. The event sparked broader conversations that lasted long after the news cycle moved on. It forced communities to look at their own homeless populations, particularly veterans, with new eyes. It became a teaching moment in schools about empathy and civic responsibility. The ultimate lesson of the Golden Spoon was profound in its simplicity. A person's value is not determined by the clothes they wear or the money in their pocket. True wealth is measured in compassion, and true heroism is often found in the quiet, simple, and revolutionary act of seeing the humanity in another person and inviting them to sit at your table. The 2 plates Stallone ordered that day fed more than just 2 men. They nourished the soul of a nation, reminding everyone that a little bit of grace can make all the difference in the world.